Oakland Athletics spent the least amount of money in all of baseball in both the 2012 and 2018 seasons, but made the playoffs in both years. The 2007 Rockies and the 2010 Rangers both finished in the bottom 10% of the league in spending, but both made the World Series. The 2008 Tampa Bay Rays spent the second least amount of money in all of baseball, but made the World Series. The 2022 Philadelphia Phillies spent $256 million in payroll, the fourth most in the league, to achieve their World Series victory, while the opposing team, the Astros, spent, a measly $194 million. Now, is it possible to buy a World Series? If we refer to this graph, you can see that over time teams have been spending more, obviously, but you can also see that it is not a straight path to the top. The team that spends the most does not always win the World Series. Now, is it possible to spend enough money on superstars to the point where you guarantee postseason success, or can you win a championship with a team of lower paid players? Well, in this video, I'll be dissecting that by going over the top 5 teams with the lowest payroll to ever win the World Series, but where do you really start with the list like this? 1920 is when the live ball era started. 1975 was when MLB outlawed the reserve clause, a clause that prevented players from seeking large contracts. 1995 is when the MLB rewrote their collective bargaining agreement, leading to teams crafting player contracts in different ways. So where exactly? Well, the answer is we're going to start with 1984, just because that seems like a cool year to start with. So yeah, as always, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe. Now, before we dive into the deep past, let's look at the not so deep past, the most recent MLB postseason of 2022. 12 teams entered the playoffs, and of those 12 teams, 4 of them placed outside the 10 highest payrolls for the year. The Mets spent the most, but only won 1 game and got bounced in round 1. The Dodgers spent the second most and got bounced in the divisional round. The White Sox, the Red Sox, and the Angels all had payrolls in the top 25% of the league, but all failed to make the playoffs. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the Mariners spent the 6th least amount of money this year, but were able to pass the Blue Jays in the wild card round. The Cleveland Guardians spent the 3rd least in all of baseball and gave the Yankees a run for their money in the divisional round. Now let's dive a little deeper. Since 1984, of the 39 World Series played, 8 winners had the highest payroll in the league, while 19 winners placed in the top 5 of the league. 15 of the postseasons since 1984 have involved at least one team that had a payroll in the bottom 15% of the league. The 1984 World Series winners Detroit Tigers technically spent the least amount of money on anybody on this list, as they only spent $9.2 million, but they ranked 10th in payroll in 1984. Now let's get into the list. The 1991 Minnesota Twins and the 2002 Anaheim Angels. Both the 1991 Twins and the 2002 Angels ranked 15th in the league in payroll when they won the World Series, but for argument's sake, since the Twins technically spent less than the Angels, $40 million less, $23.6 million total, we'll use the Twins in this slot. The Twins ended the season coming off a 74-win campaign and were 5th place in their division until June, where they were going on a 15-game win streak led by AL Rookie of the Year Chuck Knobloch and Cy Young candidate Scott Erickson. The Twins faced off against the Braves in what is considered one of the best World Series of all time, as 5 games were decided by 1 run, 3 games went into extra innings, and the final Game 7 was a 0-0 shutout that ended on a walk-off in the 10th inning. The craziest part about the 1991 World Series is that both the Braves and the Twins finished dead last in their respective divisions the previous year, so they simultaneously became the first and second teams ever to make the World Series the year after being last place in their division. The 1990s Cincinnati Reds. One might make an argument that the 1991 Twins stole the flow of the 1990s Cincinnati Reds. Just a year prior to the Twins, the Reds won the World Series despite ranking 16th in the league in payroll, spending a total of $15.9 million. Before the Brewers and the Rays mowed down lineups with their bullpens, there was the 1990 Reds, whose bullpen was led by the Nasty Boys, a trio of relievers that shut down opponents on a nightly basis. For the season, the group averaged a 2.19 ERA and combined for 44 saves and 351 strikeouts. In the 1990 World Series, the Reds faced off against the reigning champs, the Oakland Athletics, and entered as heavy underdogs, but even so, they were able to sweep the A's clean in 4 games on the backs of Billy Hatcher's 7 consecutive at-bat hit streak and the Nasty Boys not allowing a single run in 9 innings of collective work. 2015 Kansas City Royals. As a Mets fan, I'm finding it more and more triggering to continue making these lists, but alas. Yes, the 2015 Kansas City Royals won the World Series, spending $113 million, which ranks 16th in payroll that year. Funny enough, the Mets, their World Series opponent, ranked 21st in payroll, so they could have actually been on this list instead. Even funnier, the Royals finished 19th in payroll the year prior and also made the World Series, this time losing to a competent Giants. Anyways, the Royals were not a super flashy team that shocked you with power, as their home run leader Kendrys Morales only knocked in 22 bombs. The Royals also didn't stun any batters with their flame-throwing arms, as no pitcher on the team eclipsed 160 strikeouts and no starting pitcher had an ERA below 3. What the Royals were good at, though, was team baseball and coming up clutch. In Game 1 of the 2015 World Series, the Royals tied the game in the 9th and won in extras. Then Johnny Cueto, who had a 4.6 ERA, pitched a complete game shutout in Game 2, and then in Game 4, the Royals scored 3 come-from-behind runs in the 8th inning to win, and in Game 5, the Royals once again tied the game in the 9th inning and won in extras. If the Mets got even 1 save in the World Series, they would have at least made it 2-2, but alas, Yep. The 2017 Houston Astros. This may come as a surprise, but the 2017 cheating Astros actually spent an extremely small amount of money when compared to the rest of the league, as they ranked 18th in payroll, spending $124.3 million. It may be even more surprising to learn that Altuve, Bregman, Correa, and George Springer were all on the roster, but none were even close to being paid the most on the team. That prize would go to Carlos Beltran, who made a whopping $16 million that season, while only producing 51 RBIs. The tricky thing about this team on this list is obviously they were caught cheating and got a bunch of staff and players fined, but I mean, that's another video for another day. I could go into some stats regarding this team, like how they led the league in almost every major team's offensive category, like batting average, runs, on-base percentage, and slugging, but they cheated. Until the MLB allows Barry Bonds into the Hall of Fame, I will continue to not count the Astros on this list. And last but not least, the 2003 Florida Marlins. I think this entry might be a little obvious, but the 2003 Florida Marlins spent the least amount of money in baseball history while also winning the World Series the same year. In 2003, the Marlins spent $49 million, which ranked as 25th least in baseball. To put this into perspective, Jack in the Box bought Qdoba for $45 million. So maybe they could have also bought a World Series. The Marlins spent $70 million less than league average, and they spent a third of what the Yankees spent, who happened to be their World Series opponent. If we dive into their payroll, it appears to make sense, as Pudge was paid the most with $10 million, and Luis Castillo and Derek Lee made about half of that. Now let's compare this with a recent team that overpaid but had no playoff success, the 2022 Angels. In 2022, Mike Trout made $37 million, which was about 1/5 of the Angels' total payroll, which was $181 million for all the people that didn't want to do the math out there. Comparing this to Pudge, he also made about 1/5 of the Marlins' payroll in 2003. Now, Anthony Rendon and Shohei Ohtani also made about $70 million, meaning 3 players accounted for 60% of the Angels' payroll. If you want to compare this to the Marlins, their top 3 players made up about 40% of the payroll, and you need to combine the top 8 players' salary to get to the 60% mark. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it can mean a couple different things. The Angels could be terrible, but I think it's deeper than that. In 2018, Steven Pearce won the World Series MVP, but he was nothing more than a middling player that year for the Red Sox. David Freese is widely recognized for one of the most clutch performances of all time in baseball history, as he led the Cardinals over the Rangers in the 2011 World Series, but he only played in half of his team's games that year, and he was considered an average player. At the end of the day, you can stack superstars on a team, and it may work out, as did the 2020 Dodgers, but winning in baseball is more than just adding the sum of a team's parts. Team chemistry, flow, camaraderie, overall effort, and cohesiveness are all factors that every World Series team has, so maybe that's what we can take from this video. And the Mets also suck. You can take that too.